Well, greetings, whoever might be watching this. My name is Jim Stewart. I'm bringing up my presentation, which is called Lessons Learned in Establishing a Project Management Office. You see this little green thing here, little marker, just to, let you know where I'm talking at that point in time. It's the best marker I have for this. So, idea here, lessons learned in establishing a project management office. This comes from my work as a project manager. I've been a project manager for over 20 years. I think I would have gotten somewhere with my life by now, right? But that's what I'm doing. I'm a consultant. And I've been sort of informally establishing best practices at companies. What I mean by informally, or I have done, is when I go into a project, I tend to bring with me all the tools that I have to do a project better. If they're doing it badly, I try to do it better. If they're doing it well, I still try to do it better. So that's that. I'm always trying to instill best practices. But then that culminated in establishing project management offices, which is nothing more in a sense than best practices applied, if not globally, or at least departmental-wise, or regionally centralized in a sense. So really that's what that is. It's sort of a culmination of best practices, if you will, and try to implement the same. So we'll go through that for the next hour or so. Now, there are three key learning points. I've done this talk a couple of places for Project Management Institute groups and for other project groups. So they asked me to do the learning points. I said, they're good to have. So understand the three possible PMO types. I'll explain where I'm getting the types from in a minute. Understand the most important thing you must do to ensure success. There's actually a couple of things, but that was a point that I was making. And understand the role of the sponsor. All very important things. Now, you see at the bottom here, I'm based this on the Project Management Institute's Project Management Body of Knowledge, or PMBOK, 5th edition. Why? Because it's a standard. Yeah, there are other ones out there, but this is the one that I'm most familiar with, and I think it's got good stuff in it. So I'm basing it on that. So this talk is based on PMOs I've assisted in planning and setting up. As I mentioned, in best practices I've done. Now, I've done a couple this year. I'm recording this as near the end of 2016. I alternate. I do training. I do consulting. I did one for a financial services company, but I also am doing one for a local manufacturing company. Most of this is from the financial services company, although what I'm discovering is that I'm not learning a whole bunch of new lessons. I've actually talked online with people about this and presented this probably half a dozen times, and nobody's raising their hand and saying, you forgot this or you forgot that. So they have got it. You may, which is fine. You can even email me at the end and say, hey, what about this? So I can remodify it, and give you credit if you give me some new idea or something. Now, my tenure at the financial place was for 6 weeks. Now, that doesn't mean they're done. It takes a while to implement a PMO because you're doing it part-time. You don't have 10 people doing it. You're lucky if you have one. So, but I got them kick-started and we got to a certain place, and I'll summarize that later. I keep in touch with the customer for periodic updates, and I'm driving a PMO setup at a local manufacturing company, but most of the talk is based around, the standard and the financial group. So what is a PMO? This is right out of the PMBOK. A project management office is a management structure that standardizes project-related governance, that's the oversight, and facilitates the sharing of resources, methodologies, tools, and techniques. So it's more than, when I said the best practices plus. Responsibilities of a PMO can range from providing project management support functions to actually running the projects. Now, PMI recognizes three types: supportive, controlling, directive. Here we are, supportive. Now, the supportive is your minimal entry to having a PMO, and it's not really an office in a sense. It's a project manager or somebody who understands best practices well in the project management space. That could be a director or whatever. And they are providing templates and maybe even training. So think of supportive as almost like being if you had a SharePoint kind of a repository, and then you provide some training and some lessons learned. So this office sees feel to it, but it's the minimal entry to that. And some people, that's enough. Maybe in a small organization. Controlling type is where I've mostly worked. Now, it incorporates the supportive one, but it also requires compliance. Let's talk about that. So adopting a methodology. Now, the project management body of knowledge is not a methodology. It is a body of knowledge about things you could do on a project, and you would carve out of it a methodology. Three methodologies come to mind. One is called waterfall, sort of it's traditional project management for a cascading series of phases. Agile, which has been around for about 20 years and is sort of a sea change in the way that we think about project management. I have a little bit of a tutorial in here about Agile, just near the end. And then the third one I can think of, maybe more, is Prince 2. Now, Prince 2 is mandated in the UK. So now let's take it a step further. In this controlling one is compliance. So we've got templates, but I would go to, if I'm in the project office, I'm going to have project managers adhere to my methodology. So if they come in and say, well, how should I run this project? Well, is it traditional? We know the product really well. Maybe it's waterfall. If it's a new product development, maybe it's Agile. You're going to go work in the UK, you got to use Prince 2. And here's your templates. Oh, and by the way, we're going to audit your projects. What do you mean by that? Well, I say, you're going to come in every every month, 2 months, whatever. We're going to examine your artifacts. You know, how well are you doing with the risk register and the Gantt chart? How's your team building the skills? How are you getting along with the team? Not a witch hunt. The idea here is to make sure that you're, doing the job. And if you're not doing the job, you remediate your artifacts, and we get you some training and mentoring. And guess what? If you're not trainable or mentorable, maybe you need to be doing something else, because the projects are what's important here. It's not a feel-good place for people, right? And the last one is directive. And the directive one, we take control. Is my green pointer in there somewhere. We take control of projects by managing them directly. So that's relatively unusual. In other words, most project managers are inside the business units, and the PMO services them. But sometimes there won't be project managers in the business units. For example, I had a student I teach a lot, and she was working in a hospital. Doctors and nurses, it turns out, don't run projects. So she would run projects for them, whatever they may have been, from the directive PMO. But that's your choice. Now, the state of the PMO is always good to talk about. In a study from 2000, 7% of companies had a PMO. But look at this. In 14 years, it grew to 80 to 90% of firms. Now, I don't distrust this study. It's a reputable firm. I'm just not seeing that. I walk into firms and I'm not seeing this high a number. And the truth of the matter, you can see the benefits there. The truth of the matter is that these things tend to come and go. So at any one snapshot, you might have 80% doing it. And if they went back 6 months later, it might be 70%. So PMO is up and running, but is it? I've seen more failed attempts at PMOs and difficulty keeping them going, sustaining them, stoking the coal that keeps the engine, the PMO going, because it's a sort of a process-oriented place. Now, the great majority of these PMOs participate in strategic planning, a smaller number in portfolio management. Now, portfolio management is outside the scope of this talk. Portfolio management means you take all the projects and all the programs you have in-house. When I say you, by the you there, I mean it's a director or a vice president or a CEO or CIO. It's a senior thing, it's a strategic thing. And they would they don't have to use software, they can put it on spreadsheets, but they're looking at the totality of projects and programs in-house and saying, kill that one, move this project into that program, start this project. Always trying to rebalance that portfolio for the best ROI, return on investment. Now, portfolio management, strictly speaking, if I go back a page, you don't see portfolio anywhere on the page in the PMOs. There's no assumption that a PMO handles a portfolio. It might not. Really, it depends on, you can have global PMOs and you can have multiple PMOs in a company. In the case of both of the ones I've done in 2016, they had a global PMO and I was working on a departmental PMO. And the relationship between those depends. There's no one size fits all. I'll talk about both of those. Now, the biggest challenges faced by PMOs, they're not a profit center, they're a cost center. Well, that's not good. Organizations are resistant to change. Well, why does that matter? Because you're a change agent. If you put a PMO in place, you're telling people how to do things, right? You're telling people how to do things better. What do people hate? Process. What do they hate? Being told what to do. Well, that's what you're doing. You have to, because that's the nature of the beast. Sometimes even the project managers in the manufacturing one I'm working on, they're like, well, nobody will go for this. They think our project management is some, you know, thing that we do. I said, yeah, but you're missing the point. I'm here because to support you. You've bought into that idea. We're trying to change that idea. PMOs aren't necessarily well understood, often seen as an IT thing. And in fact, the manufacturing one is in IT, but they don't necessarily have to be IT. It's just that IT does so many projects. And they need to succeed quickly. And by succeed quickly, I don't mean they need to wildly succeed quickly, but they have to have some wins quickly, some sort. So they're looked at as, what is this thing? And successful PMOs don't just deliver value, they have to sort of sell that value. That's where your sponsor comes in. We'll talk about him or her. And they sell this. Here's what we did in the PMO. Now, the customer landscape in this case is this financial company. So I consult to a major Boston-based financial firm. I'm in the Boston area, greater Boston area. Now, the unusual thing here is that this customer specifically was a professional services group. And as professional services, they're providing services in-house to their in-house business units, right? So they provide services to various, I don't want to name the business units, I don't want to give anything away, but different business units had different functions. And what that PMO, what they were already doing was providing project services. When I was brought in, the director was concerned about his growth. Good guy. But he just didn't have the time to man this thing, to staff this thing himself, to run it, if you will. He needs somebody like me to come in and say, okay, help me grow. Help me grow this so that when I want more business units to come for my services, but I want to make sure I'm servicing them correctly. So he was at that growth phase, that tipping point, if you will. Now, there was a central PMO, but it was felt that this group needed their own standardized method of providing project management. Its stakeholders, as I mentioned, were some diverse business units. And each stakeholder, keyword, that PMO that I was helping set up seemed different to each one. For example, there was a woman there who was a VP that I'll talk about. She was a major, not only was she a major stakeholder, she was actually paying my consulting fees out of her budget. She wanted us to be directive. She wanted us to run her projects. Some other business units just wanted us to be a repository, and other business units wanted us to be controlling. You're probably saying that's a lot of, one of the big concerns we had was the templates. So we're going to put the templates up on SharePoint, and then we have to have slightly different templates for each one, and they had to be logoed. So make sure business unit A doesn't get business unit B. So for example, the VP I talked about, she didn't like to use a charter. She has something called a startup doc, sort of a light charter. Well, that was hers, stamped with her business unit's logo. But the other organizations wanted a charters, and they have their own logo. And by the way, you might say, wait a minute, don't you get to impose upon them what they're going to use? No. You suggest to them what they should use. There's a minimum level of what they should use. But if I come in and I say, you've got to use a charter, they're going to say, I'm not using a charter. Then I'll say, well, can you come up with a charter light? Okay. If I come in and say, you must use Microsoft Project or Primavera because they're real schedulers, and they say Excel, who wins? They do. It's my job as a consultant to tell them the pros and cons of each, but I can't force anybody to use a particular tool, right? Now, I reported the director of project management and collaborated closely with one of his major stakeholders, mentioned her already, VP of operations. They worked hand in glove. There were some well-trained project managers in the house. Second bullet. Some people have that title, but were actually systems analysts. Now, this shop, this is a financial firm, and they have a mainframe. Those of you out there who think mainframes are going away, think again. They're just sort of, behind the curtain. But these people crunch big numbers. So they have, and some of the projects we'd be running for that VP were mainframe upgrades, right? Mainframe software upgrades. So we had a mix of people. Some were project management professionals. Three of whom I trained, by the way, were my students. Some were not. Some were certified Scrum Masters for Agile. Some were getting trained on that. It was a mix of Agile and waterfall. Now, one of the first tasks I took on was to ask 3 different project managers for status reports. The reason that came about is because the VP was the portfolio manager. She had 70 projects, And her job, among other things, was to prioritize. And I offered help. She said, no, I'll take care of it. But then she called me back and said, okay, as I'm prioritizing these 70, I can't just prioritize them. There's like 5 or whatever. I didn't even know what the status is. So she asked me to go talk to 3 different project managers to find out what's going on. So that was driven by the portfolio. I got 3 different versions of what a status report was. One person gave me what I would consider a true status report. Now, he'd been a long-term contractor. It wasn't any particular template. It was a template he'd made up. One person gave me a schedule when I asked for a status report, and one just shrugged. So this is what I was dealing with, a mix of the good and the bad and the indifferent here. And my customer, by their own admission, was at best a 1.5 in the maturity scale. I don't go into maturity scale in the talk because it goes a little bit out of scope, but like the CMMI software model, there's a 1 through 5 project management model. You can imagine that 1 is pretty horrible if you rank the organization, and 5 is nirvana, where you have organizational standards in place and you've got continuous learning, whereas 1 is ad hoc project management. So this is a 1.5 organization. And you find in organizations, one business unit might be at a 3, another one at a 0 practically. So that was the name of the game here. Now, here's a summary of the lessons learned. This is what you came for. Now, I have a slide for each one of these. So I'm going to read them here, and each one has a slide. Have a sponsor. Know and manage stakeholders. Decide on a PMO structure. We kind of covered that. Create a charter. Create a schedule. Leave time for planning. You're looking at those last 3 and you're saying, this sounds like a project. Well, it is. Too many people come in to do process work and they treat it like, well, I'm running my projects. And then I do this vague amorphous process thing. No, that vague amorphous process thing should be made non-vague and non-amorphous and should have a schedule. Much easier to run that way. I want you to drive the project. One of my favorite phrases, don't boil the ocean. If you happen to be watching this from overseas, and if you've never heard that, the idea is, I think it speaks for itself. If you're a non-English speaker, don't boil the ocean. Don't try to take everything on. Can't boil the ocean. It's a possibility. You'd be tempted to. Manage change. Go for low-hanging fruit. Again, maybe not a common expression if English is a second language, but go for low-hanging fruit means just what it says. If you're standing at the tree, go for the fruit that's hanging lowest. Don't try to climb to the top and grab it, at least initially. Get down on the ground and collect metrics. I'll explain each of these. One more thing to say. Here's a question to ask yourself. Do I even need a PMO? Because you know what? I'm not here to sell you a PMO. I'm here to sell you anything. I'm doing this as a service. If somebody calls me, great. At the end, if not, so be it. But do I even need a PMO? Your goal is not to have a PMO. Your goal is to do things better, to have your projects meet their objectives. That's your goal. And to do it in a uniform fashion. I followed a LinkedIn conversation once. I follow them frequently. And they were talking about PMOs. I wasn't part of the conversation. I was just sort of lurking and observing. And the guy said, we don't need a PMO. He said, we had a gal out in California. We're here in New York. She was great. She came out. She taught a bunch of us. We got a few templates. We went our way. So you got to figure out, do I even need this thing, first of all? Right? What are the criteria that drive needing it? Now, first one, have a sponsor. Sponsor is a person that evangelizes your project. He or she is a senior person. They're an executive. Not you and me, unless I'm speaking to an executive. That person, really sells your project. And for the long haul, and for a couple of reasons, because one is you're a change agent. I can't express enough that you are a change agent. You are driving change, which everybody hates for whatever reason. So as you're making these changes, you have to have somebody who goes to the board meetings or the steering committee meetings, right? And they say, why is Jim bugging my people all the time for schedules and status reports and this and that? Remember, we signed up for charter. He's building a PMO. Oh, yeah. That's not that easy of a conversation, and it may never come up. But you want that when people, why are you here? Because that sponsor wants me here, right? If you don't have a sponsor, I'll be honest with you. If you were to call me up or email me and say, Jim, we want you to come in and create a PMO for us, and I said, do you have a sponsor? And you say, no, don't even call me. I'm not interested. It's not important, but that's not important. I don't just take business randomly. If you don't have a sponsor that will support me through the whole thing, and it's a doomed cause, as far as I'm concerned. I'll be right up front about that. Know and manage stakeholders. In real estate, they say there are three important things: location, location, location. I say in project management, those three things are stakeholders. Here's PMI's definition: an individual, group, or organization who may be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision, activity, or outcome of a project. How about that? They even think they're affected, right? You got to take care of your stakeholders. There's a whole chapter in the PMBOK about weaved throughout the book. Take care of your stakeholders. You want them on your side, and they stay on your side. It's a relationship. You know how you have personal relationships and they wither if you don't take care of them? Geez, I haven't seen Bob in a while. He doesn't call me. I don't call him. Oh, well, I guess we're not friends anymore, or whatever. Or even if it's a more intimate relationship, right? So it's a relationship with stakeholders. You got to keep it going. You have positive stakeholders, good for you. You have negative stakeholders. Sometimes, you explain to them that the PMO isn't going to take away any of their power. Do they believe that? Do they perceive that? Is it true? So people aren't dumb, right? So know your stakeholders. Now you decide on the PMO structure. This is to recap what we saw a few slides ago. Supportive, repository. Controlling, repository plus compliance. Directive, all of the above, but also run projects. Controlling is the most common type. Can appear to be any of the above. I don't think it's a particularly hard decision. It's just to figure out up front, because you need to create a charter that we'll see, and a charter will be reflective of this. You don't want a situation where you decide on a controlling one, and then 6 months down the road, some VP says to you, I thought you were going to run my projects for me. No, it's not a directive. You could do that if you'd like. That's a different project or a different PMO. And here's the charter. You should write a PMO charter. Now, if you can get the sponsor to write it, good for you. But if you're the project manager, you're the change agent, write it yourself. The scope, interview them. Objectives, success criteria. I can think of nothing more important than success criteria. When do we know we're successful? When the repository is up? When the PMO is up and running? When it's signed off on? When project's successful? What makes this successful? It's difficult to agree on that in any project. Who are the stakeholders? What are the initial risks? Constraints and assumptions. Constraints are things that limit your options per the PMBOK. For example, if you have $1 million for this thing, you don't also have $1.1 million. If you have 4 people, you don't also have 5 people. If you're going to do a supportive PMO, you can't also do a controlling. They're mutually exclusive. So you need to know what your constraints are and your assumptions. I assume that I will have a core team of myself as the project manager of this PMO project, the director, and 2 of his senior PMs available to me 10 hours a week. My assumption, I can't do it. Budget and governance. What's the oversight of this? Create a schedule. It is a project. It is temporary. It is unique. It requires resources. It requires funding. Don't kid yourself. Create a schedule in Microsoft Project, Primavera, some online software, Excel, whatever. I don't care. Create a schedule and stick to it. And the thing is, here's the important thing. This is a part-time endeavor. It could be, for me, even as the project manager who's done a couple of these, they often bring me in to do some other work while I'm there. So even for me, it's a part-time thing. Try getting a director in a meeting for this once a week, and there's 2 senior PMs who are running projects. So you're begging, borrowing, and stealing to get them to a meeting. So you want to resource them in your schedule. So now you say, boy, I can make a lot of progress in a month. Yeah, well, maybe not so much when 2 things come into play. Thing number 1 is you can only get these people, your core team, in a room 4 hours a week. And then they have to review every document that you create. So, watch out. Don't overpromise on this thing. Leave enough time for planning. Corollary of that. This planning takes time, planning for the PMO. This means meetings. Try to get at least 1 half-hour meetings. If you can't get an hour, get a half hour. Someone says they can only get 15 minutes, take it. This is just 101. I'll talk to you while I'm walking to the cafeteria, take it. In 15 minutes, which was supposed to have been an hour meeting, the director laid out 10 bullets to help me flesh out the schedule. I like to say the perfect is the enemy of the good. I didn't make that up, but I like it. So leave time for planning, but don't. I'm emphasizing this because that's always been a tendency of mine. Perfectionism. Well, I have an hour meeting planned. If I can't have my hour, we won't meet. Nope, we'll walk in the hall and I get what I can, like a reporter, scribbling things, yelling over at somebody. Where's, I mean yelling at them, but where's that information I need? And by the way, don't expect if you're the consultant doing this that your fellow project manager will welcome you with open arms. They won't. They will reject it like a real. I'm busy running a project. I know you're busy running a project, but I need information so we can make it better for you, right? Drive the project. The people that you need to meet with are always too busy. I don't care who they are. Do they have this regular job? Nobody has said to them, this is a priority. Maybe. They've got 15 projects and you are not their priority. They're going to wave you away. You got to be persistent, keep trying to get them in a meeting room. But once you get them in a meeting room, I'm talking here largely about your core team, however big it might be, yourself, your director, a couple of senior PMs. Maybe you're bringing a business analyst sometimes or two for, to help you build some artifacts. But get them focused. And I've discovered in going to a couple of companies, you have to roll with the fact that half the people in the room are looking at their laptop where they're sort of half talking to you. It's the reality. It's a distraction, but you can't let it stop. You have to keep rolling forward, running this thing like any project. Don't boil the ocean. Don't try to do everything all at once. Don't overpromise. Even in the situation with the director I was working with, the financial thing, he was very excited about this. And we came up with a list of deliverables, and I said, cut it in half. Because I said, in that month I've been here or whatever it was, I can only get little pieces of your time. So you don't want to deliver and promise to your VP we're going to have all these things, all these artifacts, all this stuff in place when there's just no way it's going to happen. So keep it reasonable. It's going to take you a while, but get this. A year from now will still be a year from now. You can either try to have everything and crash and burn, or have a smaller handful and explain to the people you're doing it for. This is a part-time thing. I can only, it's important to do the PMO. I have to deliver to customers those other projects I'm doing. This is an over and above. Manage change. Here's one of the important things. What's really important in my talk are not just the technical aspects, but what I call the socio-political. You're introducing change in the organization. Bullet number 3, the only person who likes change is a baby with a dirty diaper. People just don't like you. Even if they bring you in and say, we want to do things differently, as soon as you start throwing the different terms, believe me, I've seen this, start throwing the different terms at them. We don't do this, we don't do that. So it's a paradox. And you can read up on change management. I don't consider myself an expert in change management per se. I haven't a degree in it, but I understand it. I understand that when I get resistance, sometimes ridicule, because I bring up terms, what is that? What is this? I'm dealing with resistance. You got to learn to deal with that. That's one of the key things you have to understand. Go for the low-hanging fruit. Go for some early, relatively easy wins. So a couple of standardized artifacts, documents. For example, one of the things that we had in this financial organization, there was a dashboard to report to management, which was up there somewhere. But within the consulting group, the professional services group didn't have a dashboard. So we got one. We created one. And then we were able to put it up on our server and start using it internally. And it wasn't, don't get me wrong, it wasn't some earth-shattering thing that the VP loved. It's like, oh, but it's a sign of progress. Gee, last week I didn't have a dashboard, this week I do. Last week I didn't have a risk register, this week I do, right? So you got to show progress. Well, what are the top 3 issues? This is something I like to do, prioritize. People say, well, we have these 15 problems. Well, what are the top 3? Go for those. Get down on the ground. By that, I mean, get out and talk to your project managers. Because your stakeholders are not just the VP and the director and the business unit managers. They're also your project managers. Your project managers have to live with the artifacts. So they should be helping you create them. And in fact, they'll have them at the manufacturing company. There are 2 main project managers, some junior ones, but these 2 guys are really kind of senior. And they were sat about 30 feet from each other. And they're working on different projects. One was an Oracle guy, one was doing infrastructure work. And each had their own version of a charter, and each had their own version of a schedule, each had their own version of a risk register. And you might say that's fine, and I'm not saying it isn't. It's especially in Oracle, they have their own tools. But when I get in the room and say, yeah, your risk register is good, but it could look like this. Oh, yeah, we like that, right? So, but when you sit down with project managers, I mentioned earlier, none of the ones I talked to could agree on a status report Each one had their own way of managing a project, as I just mentioned, but yeah, depends. And in the financial organization, I'm back to that one, they were frustrated with lack of support. Now, talk to the stakeholders, project managers, everybody else. The thing you got to watch out for, I don't want to be a hatchet man. I don't want to go talk to project managers who tell me they're frustrated and I report that back to management. That won't come from me. All I want to know is what's going on. I might report back globally and say there's some frustration on here, but not Bob is frustrated. And then he looks bad, right? So I'm not going to do that. Collect metrics. Management loves metrics. So do I. You need to prove the usefulness and validity of PMO. Unless it shows value, it's often the first endeavor to get cut. Where are you now? Where will you be in 100 days, in 6 months? Management loves numbers and simplicity. As a corollary, do not bury them in PM jargon. They don't care about your Gantt chart. You're excited about your Gantt chart or Jira or some other tool that you use, if you're even excited about it. You don't want to bury them. When I was at the financial group, and it isn't even project management stuff, I would do a 3-page presentation to show the director. By the time he got done showing to his VP, it was a half a page. So, but you need to collect some kind of metrics about where you are now with projects and then measure it as you go along. You need something to show, right? Why am I doing this PMO? Even the sponsor will say at some point, you promised me results of the PMO. Yes, Miss Sponsor. Remember when I came in here? Nobody was using any artifacts. They were all using different artifacts, and all your projects were late. And now fewer of them are late. They're not all on time, but we're doing better. It's a process. Here's a big one, politics. You ignore internal company politics at your own risk. You know that's true everywhere. On this project, the financial one, I was reporting to a director, but our major stakeholder was a VP. Whenever we met with her to strategize and discuss the rollout of the PMO, there was never a time the political nature of the organization was not discussed, not once ever. We never got together to discuss politics, but she'd been there for 20 years. She always brought that in. That was what she saw as, I can sell this, I can't sell that. I can tell my boss this, I can't tell them that. So for example, this is kind of funny. We couldn't even call it a PMO. I was brought in on a job rec to create a PMO. It became abundantly clear within a week that I had to stop saying PMO, that I had to tell people we were doing a PMO. We had to call it something else because somehow that would threaten the global PMO, which was not true in the manufacturing one today because we work with the global PMO. Who knew? I mean, they were blaming me. It was just the nature of the beast. So I scrambled for it. I said, why don't I call it best practices? They said, fine. So it became best practices. So, and the other thing is, on the political side, in both of those PMO endeavors, I had to come on board and run projects to justify my salary. Senior management would say, well, if you can come on and run projects, you can do the PMO too. So that happens. Now, getting results in 100 days. Now, this is a colleague of mine, Tom Carter, wrote a blog post for me a while ago. What makes a PMO successful? So this is an example. Focus on business value in your first 100 days. What's the value to the business? Not how many Gantt charts you have, what's the value to them? Help with project status reporting. It's a good thing to do. Establish a list of all key projects in the area of the business you're responsible for. That's sort of a portfolio in a sense, but it isn't the global portfolio that you're responsible for. Survey your project managers to find out where they need assistance. Provide training and mentoring, and get project reviews. I might as well call that audits. So in 100 days, doesn't seem like a lot, but it really is, because before that you had nothing. And by reviews or audits, I mean, in the case of the financial group, we took the 2 of the 4 people on the core team were managers. They had teams, and they were also project managers. So we used them as a proof of concept. And myself and the director used them and said, okay, on Tuesday, Mary, you'll come in and we'll audit your project. And Bob, on Thursday, you'll come in. And so we got that in place. And then after I left, they definitely have more of those in place. So we had some results. You have to have some reachable results in 100 days. 6 months, now we fill positions. Somebody asked me when I spoke, how do you staff the PMO? Well, it depends, isn't it? If it's a supporting one, there's no staff. I mean, there's a person part-time. If it's a directive one, on the opposite end, running projects, well, how many projects can your people run? I'm not a fan of a project manager running more than 2 or 3 projects, so you have to staff it accordingly. So I don't have a magic wand for that. You can look at metrics online, but it really depends on how many projects you're running or how full-fledged the PMO is. Now you've got guidelines for project planning and estimating in use. Startup services, that's something we're working on. A new project is being kicked off, and we would go over as the PMO and say, okay, we're going to help you kick it off. We'll facilitate a meeting to kick it off. And those aren't as easy as they sound. I've done a number of those where you facilitate a meeting to get people going. Often if you get people just, even like the PMOs when I do them, I sort of get them out of their inertia, these PMOs, and get them to a certain place. And then once they have that momentum, they can keep it going. Same as a project, and sort of pull them out of the mud and get them going. Portfolio management, incorporated or not, depending. Process to review and prioritize projects defined, agreed to, and in use. And metrics are in place. Now, these are just some sample results. You need to prioritize what you think is important. That whole thing about having a good dashboard was very important. And the manager, the director where I was working, we had our own dashboard, but the company had this big automated dashboard, this thing of beauty. He wanted to physically tap into that. That was his goal, was to tap into that. But again, it's baby steps, right? Now, that was talking more about the waterfall. Not that there isn't some overlap, don't get me wrong. But that first part was based around waterfall. And when I was first going to present this at a PMI chapter, the chapter president said, could you incorporate some stuff about Agile? I said, sure. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Agile is without, not a whole lesson, just to give you a sense of it for those of you. And I found out that even though Agile has been around for some 20 years, a lot of people have never touched it, even peers of mine who have been around doing project management that long. And when I was teaching class, if I had 15 people in a class, I'd be lucky if 2 of them had ever heard of it. So that may surprise some of you, but I will give a little bit of a summary of it. Now, Agile, which is an adaptive sort of a methodology, has less overhead than plan-driven projects by definition. They may not even be in need for a PMO in an all-Agile organization, although I rethought that since I wrote that. Plan-driven projects, which are the typical waterfall, are very prevalent. There might be a hybrid. This is what I'm seeing more and more. Very common is, a PMO that does both plan-driven / waterfall and adaptive / agile. And you might say, well, geez, wouldn't one of the main things, components of that be for the PMO to say, this is a waterfall, that's agile? Sure, absolutely. But let's refresh on what agile is. Now, the Agile Manifesto, there were a number of guys, actually a couple of them from here in Boston where I am, went out to Colorado. There were a couple of the guys I think there were 17 guys. And their manifesto said, we're uncovering better ways of developing software, helping others do it. They found that if they're writing software, and you can use Agile for anything, if they're writing software, they'd often, at the end of, some piece of time, some phase, they have more documentation than they have software. They weren't creating software. They were, but they weren't creating it as adeptly as they might. And they weren't open to change as much as they'd like. So the idea of the Agile Manifesto is very straightforward. There is value in the items on the right, but they value the items on the left more. So individuals and interactions over process and tools, working software over comprehensive documentation. Not that there's no documentation. If you're doing an IT project, you need testing, documents and functional specs and whatnot. But working software is what's driving them. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation, and responding to change over following a plan. Again, that's not to say that you can't respond to change in the plan-driven or waterfall environment. It's just that you heavily plan in the waterfall environment, and then change is a little more difficult, whereas you're sort of always planning in Agile, and you're always responding to change. So in the Scrum variant, now there are 4 or 5 different variants of Agile, XP, Crystal, etc. I'll stick with Scrum for this reason. A, it's the most popular. B, I'm certified in it. So what happens is a product owner creates a prioritized wish list called a product backlog. During sprint planning, the sprint is a time box. the team pulls a small chunk from the top of that wish list, a sprint backlog, which is the activities they're going to do, decides to implement it, with the assistance of the product owner, Scrum Master, and team. The team has a certain amount of time, a sprint, 2 weeks or 4 weeks, to complete its work, but it means every day to assess its progress, daily Scrum. Along the way, the Scrum Master keeps the team focused on its goal. Scrum Master in this case is not a project manager. There is no project manager in this. Scrum Master, you come to the Scrum Master and you say, I need a room tomorrow. Okay, I'll get you one. I need software. Okay, I'll get it for you. Somebody's bugging me to work on something else. I'll try to get him to go away. But if you come to me as a Scrum Master and say, tell us how to do this, I say, no, not my job. You figure out how to do it. The team is self-organizing. The whole thing there. At the end of the sprint, let's say it's 2 weeks, the work should be potentially shippable, ready to hand to a customer, put on a store shelf, or show to a stakeholder. Sprint ends with a sprint review, a demonstration, and a retrospective, a look back at what went well, and then the whole thing starts again. Now, these are 2 or 4 weeks, so very, very adaptable to change and going forward. So you might say, wow, if you haven't heard it or work with this, it's a whole different thing. How would the PMO fit in? Well, one way I mentioned already is that idea of which one should be the classic demarcation, and this isn't perfectly exact. If you're making the same product over and over, and for example, when I was working in a manufacturing company, I was working in IT within manufacturing, not in a factory. The guy I was working with who was doing Oracle was doing these Oracle projects that never really vary. Oracle provides a whole suite of project management ideas and artifacts around it. So the plan-driven or waterfall worked perfectly fine for him. He was doing more or less the same thing over and over again. But now if you're doing new product development, what do you have? You have uncertainty in what people want or in the tools they're going to use or the technology. Now Agile lends itself well to that. Now in the Agile PMO, the project direction in that environment shifts more towards the business side, the product owner, and there's more of an emphasis on business value. They don't call him or her the sponsor, but it's kind of like that idea. Portfolio management can be part of it or not. Again, in the Agile PMO, we discussed that. I discussed bullet 3, which type it might be. Now, here's a key thing it can provide. So think about it. There isn't a lot of documentation. There's some documentation in Agile, but the focus is in documentation. So you don't have a million templates. So a big deal would be providing mentoring and coaching. So now different groups throughout the organization, as you're doing this, we're going to do our first Scrum. Can somebody come over and kickstart us, like I talked about before, get us in a mindset? And Agile, I'm not an Agile coach. I'm a Scrum Master. I'd like to be an Agile coach one day, but I don't have enough yet to get there. But the Agile coach might come out and get people in the right mindset to do this. And the transition from project manager to Scrum Master may not be easy. They can mentor in that. If you're a project manager and you're doing your first Scrum, you're trying to direct things. You're not supposed to. You're supposed to let the team be self-organizing. So he or she can help set the tone for that. The team coach works with it. I will say, too, what I've learned in the past 6 months is how much Agile is not perfectly implemented anywhere. People are doing it in a hybrid fashion, especially when I try to bring it at the manufacturing facility. They consistently try to get it in the frame of thought of what they already knew, which is okay, but I couldn't convince. They just believed that Agile was waterfall faster. Not really. But I thought when I first was introduced to it. Now, here we go. Locking a strong requirement for documentation. The PMO tends to be more advisory and consultative. Now, we're currently considering default documentation templates for stories, which are kind of requirements in Agile, risk, product backlog. You need some documents. They can very often they're just spreadsheets. I personally know of a large bank who have a stage gate process. Now, stage gates in waterfall are phases. You have these phases. At the end of these phases, it goes in front of a steering committee who says, yes, go forward, no, don't go forward. But since sprints are 2 weeks a pop, right, or 4 weeks at a time, you're not going to have a stage gate. So they have a stage gate process at the end of a charter, at the end of the discovery readiness, and then checkpoints along the way. And you have to sort of come up with how you're going to, you can see here, checkpoints for go, no go. You still want to have a go, no go, even if it's Agile. you may decide this product isn't worth it. And this PMO also tracked metrics such as team velocity. Velocity is how many stories you get done. You know, the first sprint we got 5 stories done, then we get 10 stories done, we get 8 stories done. Whether that knowing team A's velocity helps team B, unclear on that. Maybe, you know, that team A seems to really work well together. Why is that? So the Agile PMO, they help set up checkpoints for that. Now, as I'm developing the current PMO, I'm keeping a copy of the Agile Manifesto in front of me. Remember that manifesto? I'll go back to it here. I keep this up in front of me as a reminder to keep me on point, on track. This is the Agile. It's very brief. There's more to it. There's underlying theory. You can find all this online. Scrum Alliance, agilemanifesto.org, scrum.org. There was actually a schism at one point between some of the leaders of Scrum. That was the Scrum Alliance and Scrum.org. So figure that out, all right? I don't know all the politics behind it, so I'm not, that's outside my scope. We're not necessarily dictating how Agile is manifested in projects. Let people do what they do. For example, Kanban boards come out, I believe they come out of their visual aid. They come out of, I believe, the lean variant of Agile. They're not necessarily part of Scrum, but somebody wants to use them. Why am I opposed to that? Why am I opposed to anything that works? I'm not there to dictate to them as the PMO. And we're trying to use formats that people are already familiar with. What I mean by that is this. This something was brought home to me by one of the guys who's been working this manufacturing IT shop for 10 years. He said, when you bring any new artifact in our Agile world to the boss, bring it to a format he's already familiar with. So he was already familiar with having, you know, a requirements traceability matrix, which does just that in the waterfall world in a spreadsheet. So we made our product backlog in a spreadsheet. That's not revolutionary, but try to, you know, help people who are working in the waterfall world adapt to Agile by making artifacts that they're familiar with. You can change them later. I think the key here is to make sure that the Agile PMO is Agile, right? Adhere to its philosophy, if you will. It's a different head. It's a different idea. Now, a few relevant quotes. We're almost done here. I had posted a variant of this on LinkedIn, and these two gentlemen gave me permission to quote them. The critical element, as one of them says, is defining what services will be offered and aligning that to the strategic goals and needs of the organization. So yes, strategy, strategy, strategy. And the other one, and my colleague Tom said the same thing, bullet number 2. Make sure you staff the PMO with the best talent you can find. Now, build trust with the stakeholders. That's always important. But, you know, I've worked with some project managers who are arrogant. And they come in and basically have a my way or the highway. I'm the expert. I'm going to tell you how to do things. You don't want that in your PMO for the obvious reason. You don't want people who are going to rub people the wrong way. You want a good politician. You want good politicians in your PMO and good project managers, right? Now, here's updated financial company status. The PMO project started mid-January 2016. Within 6 weeks, we'd established the PMO structure. I took some hammering out. Repository of templates. And by the way, they had templates. One of my first jobs was to review them and make sure they were PMBOK compliant and that they worked. There was no charter for whatever reason, so I created one. Proof of concept for the first project review / audits, and a schedule for the ongoing work for the rest of the year. So it was pretty good for 6 weeks. Doesn't seem like a lot, but that wasn't 40 hours a week. It was a couple hours a week at best. It was part-time, very part-time even for me. Since then, they've embarked on group training for 10 different artifacts. Let me explain that. Sometimes even the smartest people are lose sight of the forest for the trees. So the director was going to put a bunch of artifacts up on this repository to make the VP happy and check the box off. I said, well, okay, one of the artifacts you're putting up there is a risk register. He said, yeah. I said, do your people all know how to do risk analysis? He said, not necessarily. I said, behind every artifact is a process. So before you put an artifact up, I'd rather see you put up 2 well-understood artifacts that your people know how to create than 10 that they're flummoxed by and don't know how to do. So we agreed on that, and he was going to roll out, you know, interim versions, the light version of the risk register, and then the post-training one. So he's getting people trained. They had several peer review meetings for a dozen projects. of project managers, establish a portfolio tracker, and that's the portfolio of the projects that they're worried about, and added more projects into that review/audit process. And so they're making progress, and it's still ongoing. This is their second attempt at trying to do. Both these organizations, by the way, had tried and failed to do PMOs before. It's not that I'm such a genius at doing any of this. It's just that finally they had the commitment. It's hard to keep them going when everybody, it's sort of a process thing. Everybody sort of called it to something else. Next thing you know, 3 years later, nothing has happened. On the manufacturing side, charter is created and signed off. Weekly core team meeting is going well. What is Agile? Let me explain why I did a presentation. When I got there to the manufacturing company, I was trained in Scrum, and so was another project manager. He has the PMI certification, which is a broader certification. Another project manager, the guy doing the Oracle work, smart guy, but knew nothing about Agile, and the director didn't. So I said, why don't I do a presentation for you guys? So I put it in the presentation called What is Agile, and I provided it to them so they understand what it was. I don't think they entirely got it, especially the director, because he kept trying to make it sound like it was waterfall. So he needs a lot of sort of, work to keep educating. You have to educate up sometimes, right? Governance document was created, steering committee information, etc. Initial artifacts are in place, risk register charter, schedule, scope statement, etc. And by the way, sometimes the artifacts are good enough. So for example, I might come in and say, you need a scope statement in a Word document. They say, we do a scope in PowerPoint. I say, is it working for you? They say, yeah, okay. So I don't try to, fix what ink broke. And the reach was extended to the acquired company. What this means is the manufacturing company I was working with had just bought a company in California. And you can imagine that at any level above me was dragged into that more than 50% of their time. So we had started to incorporate them into our world of artifacts and PMO because they had very little project management background as it happens, for whatever reason. I don't know why, but they did. So we're trying to bring them in as well. That's what's happening in the manufacturing company. And I think we're almost, here's the 3 key learning points. There's a reiteration of what we saw in an early slide. So we talked about the possible PMO types, which you should choose. I can't tell you what to choose. You have to look at that. Most important thing you must do to ensure success. I think there's a couple. Everything I showed you is important. If I had to pick 2 things, not just one thing. One is it's the socio-political that I care about most. You're a change agent. People hate change. You'll be getting resistance and you won't know why because they'll be resisting, but they won't even know why because they don't like change. And the political thing. Be very wary of politics. And the sponsor understand his or her role. He or she is there to help you. And that's me. That's my talk. Jim Stewart. You want to give me a call? Give me a call. There's my LinkedIn profile. There's my website. I write on my blog. Probably should do it more often. Try to do that. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. And I periodically blast things out on Twitter. And again, if you feel like writing to me, I don't even have my email address there, or do I? Well, it's my email address is I will give you JSTEWART, J Stewart, at jpstewartassociates.com. That's jstewart at jpstewartassociates.com. No obligation. Write and ask me questions. We'll talk. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed it.